Imagine a boy born in poverty, who lost his mother young, failed in business, and was rejected in love. A man mocked for his looks, beaten by failure, and crushed by grief. Yet, through pain and loss, he rose to fight slavery and lead a broken nation. This is not just history, it's the story of Abraham Lincoln's impossible journey. Imagine a 9-year-old boy watching his mother die, and realizing life will never be kind to him again. Abraham Lincoln was born in a small wooden cabin in Kentucky, far away from the comforts of city life. His family lived in deep poverty. There were no luxuries in their home. The floor was made of dirt, food was always limited, and winters were long and harsh. From the very beginning, life was full of struggle for this boy. His father, Thomas Lincoln, worked hard as a farmer, but the family never had enough. Every day was about survival, not dreams. In this poor environment, tragedy came early. When Abraham was only 9 years old, his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, became ill. She had unknowingly drunk poisoned milk from cows that had eaten a deadly plant. No medicine could save her, and within days she died. For young Abraham, the loss was unbearable. His mother had been his comfort and support. Her death left an emptiness that he carried throughout his life. Standing beside her grave, Abraham felt the world grow colder. After a year, his father decided to remarry. He brought home a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, who became Abraham's stepmother. Unlike his father, Sarah was kind and caring. She treated Abraham with love, gave him encouragement, and supported his desire to read. For Abraham, she was a blessing after so much pain. Yet even with her kindness, life at home was not easy. His father remained strict and often harsh. Thomas mocked his son, beat him when he was displeased, and never believed Abraham would achieve anything important. The distance between father and son only grew with time. Without warmth from his father, Abraham turned to books. He had little formal schooling, but his hunger for learning was strong. He taught himself to read and write. Whenever he could find a book, he would read it by the firelight late into the night. The Bible became his guide, and the works of Shakespeare gave him language and rhythm that later shaped his speeches. He memorized long passages and repeated them until they became part of him. Reading gave him a world beyond the cabin walls, a place where he could dream of something greater. This boy, growing up in a log cabin, knew pain, loss, and hardship more than comfort. But he also knew the power of words, the strength of persistence, and the comfort of learning. Books became his closest friends, giving him hope when life gave him none. Yet Abraham had no idea that beyond his childhood sorrows, the road ahead was filled with failures that would test him again and again. But the boy who loved books had no idea. His failures were about to begin. What happens when a boy with dreams enters the real world and finds only rejection waiting? As Abraham Lincoln grew into his teenage years, the cabin life began to feel too small for his restless mind. He was tall, strong, and eager to prove himself, but opportunities were scarce. His father still did not encourage his ambitions, and so Abraham often worked for others to earn a little money of his own. One of his earliest jobs was helping transport goods along rivers. It was hard labor, but it gave him his first taste of independence. At 17, Abraham was hired to work on a flatboat. This boat carried cargo down the Mississippi River, and for the first time in his life, he left the quiet forests and farmlands of Indiana behind. The journey eventually took him to New Orleans, a city unlike anything he had ever seen. To a boy who had grown up in poverty, New Orleans looked vast, colorful, and full of life. There were tall buildings, busy markets, and crowds of people from different places and backgrounds. Abraham was amazed by the scale of the city and how different it was from the world he knew. But New Orleans also opened his eyes to something far darker. While exploring the city, Abraham came across a slave market. There, human beings were chained, bought, and sold like animals. Families were torn apart as husbands, wives, and children were auctioned to different buyers. Lincoln stood in silence, watching the cruelty. He had grown up poor and had suffered losses, but nothing compared to what he saw in that moment. That image of human suffering burned into his mind. Even though he was just a teenager with no power, a quiet thought planted itself deep in his heart. One day, if given the chance, he would fight against this evil. For now, though, Abraham's life remained ordinary. He returned from New Orleans and continued taking small jobs, splitting rails, clerking in shops, and doing whatever work came his way. He was not yet a man of fame or success. People around him saw only a tall, awkward young man who worked hard, but was nothing special. He earned little, struggled to find direction, and often felt the sting of rejection. Still, inside him grew a determination that he did not fully understand yet. Every book he read, every job he worked, and every hardship he faced was quietly shaping the man he would become. Abraham Lincoln had no wealth, no social standing, and no one who believed in his future. He was just another worker in a world that rarely showed kindness. Yet behind this ordinary life was a spirit that refused to break. His steps were small, his dreams uncertain, but the memory of those chained men and women in New Orleans stayed with him. It was a memory that would guide him in ways he could not yet imagine. But one day, this ordinary worker would face his first great failure. The boy who hated slavery was still powerless. He carried the image of chained men and broken families in his mind, but he had no strength to change their fate. He was only a worker with empty pockets and uncertain paths ahead. Yet, what he did not know was that destiny was shaping him through every struggle. Each rejection, each failure, and each moment of pain was not meant to break him. It was meant to harden him. The same boy who once stood helpless in New Orleans would one day stand tall before the nation. But before he could become a leader, he first had to lose, stumble, and fall. His journey to greatness was not built on victories, but on the strength born from failure. When a young man walks into a new town, he thinks his life will change. For Lincoln, it began with disaster. After years of small jobs and wandering, Abraham moved to New Salem, Illinois, in his early 20s. The town was small but lively, and he believed it might offer him the chance to finally build a future. He took work at a local store, hoping to settle into a stable job. For the first time, it seemed like life was opening a door for him. But fate was unkind. The store's owner soon shut it down, leaving Abraham unemployed and disappointed. His very first attempt at building a career ended in failure. Yet even in failure, Abraham's character began to shine. While working at the store, he had handled customers honestly and treated people with fairness. On one occasion, he realized a customer had paid more than the correct amount. Instead of ignoring it, Abraham walked miles to return the extra money. On another day, he discovered goods had been measured incorrectly and again made sure the customer got back what was owed. These simple acts of integrity earned him a reputation that would stay with him forever. People in New Salem began calling him Honest Abe, a name that reflected the trust and respect he had gained. Though his career in business had failed, his honesty made him popular. Friends and townspeople began encouraging him to try something different: politics. They believed his intelligence, fairness, and ability to speak could help him serve the community. Abraham, unsure but curious, agreed to run for the Illinois state legislature at only 23 years old. It was his first step into the political world. With enthusiasm and hope, he began his campaign. But the result was another disappointment. Abraham lost the election. The defeat was crushing, and many young men in his place would have walked away. He had no money, no position, and now no victory to show for his efforts. It seemed like life was reminding him once again of his limits. Yet Lincoln's spirit did not break. The failure stung, but it also taught him a lesson, that success would not come easily, and that if he wanted to rise, he would need persistence stronger than his losses. The people of New Salem still remembered his honesty even after the election. Though he was defeated, he did not lose their respect. In fact, his refusal to give up made him stand out even more. Abraham began to understand that leadership was not about winning quickly. It was about staying firm through setbacks. This was the beginning of his slow, painful climb toward greatness. A defeat at 23 could have ended his dreams. But Lincoln was too stubborn to quit. What do you do when you lose elections, have no money, and cannot even win in wrestling? For Abraham Lincoln, the years after his first defeat were filled with trial after trial. To survive, he took on any work that came his way. He split rails for fences, carried letters as a postman, and later tried his hand as a land surveyor. None of these jobs made him rich, but they kept food on his table. More importantly, they built his reputation as a hard-working and reliable young man who never complained about the hardships of life. During this time, Lincoln also tried to prove himself in another way. He challenged Jack Armstrong, the local wrestling champion, to a match. The fight drew a crowd, with the whole town eager to see if the tall, awkward young man could stand against the powerful champion. Lincoln fought bravely but lost. Yet something remarkable happened. The people admired his courage and good spirit. Instead of mocking him, they respected him, and he gained new friendships from that single loss. Even in defeat, his character brought people closer to him. Still searching for success, Lincoln opened a small business with a partner named William Barry. Together they started a general store called Barry and Lincoln. Lincoln hoped this would finally bring him stability, but the business quickly fell apart. Barry drank heavily and neglected the work, while Lincoln lacked the business skills to keep it alive. Soon the store collapsed, leaving behind debts instead of profits. When Barry later died, the full weight of the debt, about $1,800, fell on Lincoln's shoulders. It was a crushing burden, and it would take him 15 long years to pay it off. As if financial troubles were not enough, Lincoln's personal life was struck by tragedy. During his time in New Salem, he fell deeply in love with a young woman named Anne Rutledge. She was bright, kind, and gentle, and for the first time Abraham felt true happiness in love. They dreamed of a future together, but fate was cruel once again, and fell ill with typhoid fever and died suddenly. Lincoln was devastated. The grief overwhelmed him so deeply that his friends feared for his mental health. He would later admit that this was one of the darkest moments of his entire life. At this stage, Abraham Lincoln had nothing to show for his efforts. He had lost an election, failed in business, carried crushing debt, and buried the woman he loved. To anyone else, the dream of rising higher would have seemed impossible. But hidden in all this pain was the shaping of a man who would not give up. Lincoln had lost his career, his partner, and the woman he loved. Could he ever rise again? At his lowest point, Lincoln could have disappeared into history. He was a failed shopkeeper, burdened with crushing debt, and a broken-hearted man who had buried his first true love. Many in his place would have given up, living quietly in the shadows, remembered by no one. But Abraham Lincoln's story was not meant to end in New Salem. A new chapter was waiting for him, and it would begin in Springfield. The move to this growing city would bring him new friends, new opportunities, and the first real steps toward the destiny that seemed so far away. Springfield would not erase his pain, but it would transform it into purpose. And from this point on, the path of his life would never be the same. What if the man with no money, no looks, and no family name found his place inside a courtroom? When Abraham Lincoln moved to Springfield, he carried little more than ambition and determination. He had no wealth, no family influence, and still carried the heavy debt from his failed business. But Springfield gave him the chance for a fresh start. Surrounded by lawyers, politicians, and businessmen, Lincoln decided to study law seriously. He read books for hours, often teaching himself from borrowed materials. Slowly, with discipline and persistence, he began to master the field. By the mid-1830s, Lincoln had become a practicing lawyer. His first cases were small, land disputes, debt collections, and minor criminal trials. But his honesty and clarity soon stood out. He did not try to confuse the jury with difficult words. Instead, he spoke plainly, with stories and logic that ordinary people understood. Judges and clients began to respect him. Over time, Lincoln transformed from a struggling rail splitter into a trusted attorney in Springfield. His career brought something more than respect. It brought financial stability. For the first time in his life, he began earning enough money not only to live comfortably, but also to slowly pay off the debts that had weighed on him for years. Each payment was a reminder of his promise to honor what he owed. Even though no one forced him to, it took years of effort. But Lincoln's reputation as a man of integrity grew stronger with every step. While his career improved, his personal life also found direction. In Springfield, Lincoln met Mary Todd, a young woman from a wealthy and well-connected family. She was intelligent, ambitious, and saw great potential in him even when others doubted. Their courtship had its ups and downs, and Lincoln, with his insecurities, sometimes wondered if he was good enough for her. But Mary believed in his future. Eventually, in 1842, they married, beginning a partnership that would play a central role in his rise. By the 1840s, Abraham Lincoln was no longer the poor, wandering boy of Kentucky or the heartbroken shopkeeper of New Salem. He was a respected lawyer, a husband, and a man slowly building a foundation for the future. Yet, beneath his professional success and family life, one issue never left his thoughts. Every time he remembered the slave markets of New Orleans, the chains and the auctions, he felt a quiet fire burn inside him. His career as a lawyer gave him stability, but deep inside, he knew that his true calling would be much larger. But even as he built a stable life, the ghost of slavery never left his mind. A lawyer in Springfield heard a senator's speech and decided to fight back with words that shook the crowd. Abraham Lincoln had been busy with his law practice, earning a name in Illinois, but politics still called to him. When Senator Stephen Douglas defended slavery, arguing that each state should decide for itself whether to allow it, Lincoln felt compelled to answer. He could not forget the scenes of chained men he had witnessed in New Orleans as a teenager. For Lincoln, slavery was not just a political issue. It was a moral wound tearing the nation apart. When he rose to speak, many expected little from the tall, plain-looking lawyer. But as Lincoln's words filled the hall, the atmosphere changed. He argued that slavery was not simply a matter of choice for states, because it struck at the very heart of human equality. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he declared, warning that America could not survive half free and half slave. His calm but forceful logic, combined with stories and examples ordinary people could understand, left the crowd in awe. For the first time, Lincoln's voice carried far beyond Springfield. This moment led to the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Across Illinois, crowds gathered to see the two men face off. Douglas was polished, confident, and a skilled speaker. Lincoln was less graceful, but he spoke with honesty and conviction. He challenged Douglas's defense of slavery by appealing not only to the law, but to humanity itself. He reminded audiences that black people were not property, but human beings entitled to the same natural rights described in the Declaration of Independence. His words stirred emotions, and even those who disagreed could not ignore him. The debates drew national attention. Newspapers printed transcripts, spreading Lincoln's words across the country. Suddenly, A lawyer from Illinois who had once been buried under debt and heartbreak was being discussed in Washington and beyond. He had become a rising figure in American politics, admired for his moral courage and plain-spoken wisdom. Yet, when the votes were counted, Lincoln lost the Senate race to Stephen Douglas. For many, that defeat would have been the end. But the debates had done something more powerful than winning an office. They had introduced Lincoln to the nation. People who had never heard of him before now knew his name. They saw in him not only a lawyer or a politician, but a man willing to speak the truth, even when it cost him victory. Lincoln had lost the Senate race, but America had just found a new voice. The man who kept losing elections was about to be asked to run for president. How can a failed businessman, failed lover, and failed politician become a presidential candidate? Abraham Lincoln's life, until now, looked like a story of small victories and bigger defeats. But history often turns on the most unlikely men. By the late 1850s, the political landscape of America was shifting. The Whig Party, once Lincoln's base, had collapsed. A new political force was rising. The Republican Party, built on the idea of limiting the spread of slavery. Lincoln, with his reputation from the debates against Stephen Douglas, soon became one of its rising stars. When the Republican National Convention was scheduled in Chicago in 1860, many expected stronger names to dominate the field. William Seward, a powerful senator from New York, was considered the favorite. Lincoln, by contrast, was a small-town lawyer with no wealth, no grand connections, and a history filled with defeats. Few believed he could truly win. But in politics, sometimes being underestimated becomes an advantage. At the convention, delegates argued, bargained, and shifted loyalties. Seward had passionate supporters, but he also had fierce enemies. Some feared his bold anti-slavery stance might alienate moderate voters. Lincoln, however, was different. He opposed slavery, but his tone was measured, his language calm. He was firm in principle, yet careful enough not to drive people away. Delegates who disliked Seward began to see Lincoln as the safer choice, a man who could unite the party. As the ballots were counted, excitement spread. On the first round, Seward led, but Lincoln was close behind. On the second, Lincoln gained momentum. By the third ballot, it was clear. Abraham Lincoln had secured the nomination. The announcement shook the hall in Chicago, and shouts of celebration filled the air. The rail splitter from Kentucky, who once failed as a shopkeeper and wept over personal losses, was now chosen to lead a new political movement. And where was Lincoln during this dramatic moment? Not in the convention hall, but back home in Springfield. While his friends and supporters fought for his name in Chicago, Lincoln was playing handball outside a local building. Suddenly, a messenger arrived breathless, carrying the news. Lincoln had been nominated for President of the United States. The tall, awkward lawyer who had grown up in poverty, worked on riverboats, failed in business, and lost elections, had just been chosen to run for the highest office in the land. It was a moment both unbelievable and undeniable. His failures had not ended his journey. They had prepared him for this. The nation, divided and restless, had chosen a man shaped by struggle. Yet, as Lincoln would soon realize, winning the nomination was the easy part. But winning the nomination was easy compared to winning the divided nation. What happens when half the country refuses to even print your name on the ballot? That was the reality Abraham Lincoln faced in 1860. His nomination had surprised many, but the road ahead was even more uncertain. The United States stood divided, not just in opinion but in spirit. The issue of slavery had torn the nation into pieces, and even before the votes were cast, the election carried the weight of a coming storm. The Democrats, once united, split into two camps. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old rival, represented the Northern Democrats, who believed in allowing each state to decide on slavery. The Southern Democrats, unwilling to compromise, chose their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge, who strongly defended the right to expand slavery into new territories. A fourth candidate, John Bell, tried to keep the Union together by avoiding the slavery issue altogether. In this crowded field, Lincoln stood as the Republican candidate, firm in his promise. Slavery would not spread into the new territories of America. His message inspired many in the North, but in the South, his name was treated as an enemy's. In fact, in most Southern states, Lincoln's name was not even printed on the ballot. Voters in those states were denied the choice of supporting him, as if to erase his presence from their world. When the election came, the divided opposition worked in Lincoln's favor. Douglas gathered votes in the North, but not enough to challenge him. Breckinridge captured the Deep South, while Bell found support in the border states. Lincoln, however, swept the North and the West, securing enough electoral votes to become the 16th President of the United States. He had won, not with overwhelming national support, but because his opponents could not unite. The victory, however, brought not celebration but crisis. The moment his election was announced, Southern leaders erupted in fury. To them, Lincoln's presidency meant the beginning of the end for slavery. Before he could even take office, several Southern states declared they would leave the Union. They formed their own government, calling it the Confederate States of America. Lincoln had dreamed of leading a united country, but before he could even set foot in the White House, the country itself was breaking apart. He was president-elect, but his people were already at war with one another. Lincoln had won the presidency, but now his country was tearing apart before his eyes. Even before taking the oath, Lincoln's victory felt dangerous. The South saw him not as a president, but as a threat to their way of life. Angry crowds shouted his name with hatred, and letters filled with death threats reached his home daily. As he prepared to travel from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration, it became clear that this was no ordinary journey. Assassins were rumored to be waiting along the route, determined to end his life before he could ever take office. What should have been a proud march to the White House turned into a battle of survival. Lincoln was not yet president, but already he was fighting to stay alive. Imagine becoming president, but not knowing if you will live to reach the Capitol. That was Abraham Lincoln's reality after the election of 1860. Instead of preparing for a peaceful transition, he prepared for danger. From Springfield to Washington, his journey stretched nearly 1,600 miles. Crowds gathered to see him at every stop, some cheering, some silent, and some filled with open hatred. Newspapers across the South called him a tyrant before he had even taken office, and rumors of plots against his life grew louder each day. As Lincoln's train moved eastward, detectives and allies discovered frightening news. Organized groups were planning to assassinate him before he reached Washington. In Baltimore, one plot was so serious that authorities insisted on a secret plan. Lincoln, known for his tall, recognizable figure, agreed reluctantly to disguise himself and change his travel schedule. He slipped quietly into Washington at night, heavily guarded and hidden from the public eye. To some, this looked like cowardice. To others, it was a necessary step to keep the new president alive. When he finally arrived in the Capitol, the mood was not celebratory. Washington, D.C. felt more like an armed camp than a city welcoming a new leader. Soldiers patrolled the streets, rifles ready. Cannons were placed to guard public buildings. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every stranger a possible enemy. Lincoln, who had once walked freely through small towns as Honest Abe, now had to live behind constant protection. On March 4, 1861, he stood before the divided nation to take the oath of office. His speech was calm but firm, pleading with the South not to break the Union. He reminded Americans that they were not enemies, but countrymen. Yet even as his words reached the crowd, the air was thick with tension. Many believed violence could break out at any moment. Union troops stood ready to defend him as he placed his hand on the Bible and became the 16th President of the United States. The ceremony ended without bloodshed, but the threat never faded. For Lincoln, survival had already become part of the presidency. He knew that men wanted him dead, that states were already seceding, and that war loomed close. Taking the oath was not the beginning of peace. It was the first step into a storm that would last for years. But taking the oath was only the beginning. Now he had to fight a bloody war. The Civil War began in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. Lincoln suddenly found himself not only president of a divided nation, but the commander of a war unlike anything America had ever seen. His goal was clear: preserve the Union. But almost everything else was uncertain. Which generals to trust, which strategies to follow, and how to handle the growing anger on both sides. At first, Lincoln believed the war might be short. He called for volunteers, expecting the Union Army to quickly crush the rebellion. But early battles like Bull Run ended in disaster, and the Union soldiers were sent running. The newspapers mocked Lincoln, calling him weak and unprepared. Some headlines declared the war already lost, while others accused him of being a dictator for sending troops without full approval from Congress. Adding to the pressure, Lincoln's own generals often failed him. He appointed George McClellan to lead the Union Army, but McClellan was cautious to the point of paralysis. While Confederate generals struck boldly, McClellan hesitated, refusing to attack even when he had the advantage. Lincoln grew frustrated, writing that if McClellan did not want to use the army, he would like to borrow it for a while. Eventually, he had no choice but to fire McClellan and replace him with other commanders, but most of them also disappointed him. Each change brought fresh criticism from the press and from politicians who doubted his leadership. Lincoln was not only fighting a war on the battlefield, he was also fighting a war of words in the media. Newspapers published vicious cartoons mocking his appearance, calling him the ape or the tyrant. Political rivals accused him of destroying the Constitution by suspending habeas corpus, allowing the government to arrest suspected rebels without trial. Every decision seemed to bring more enemies. Yet Lincoln believed that in times of crisis, preserving the nation had to come before protecting his popularity. Behind the scenes, he struggled with deeper questions of morality. Was the war only about saving the Union, or was it also about ending slavery? He knew that freeing enslaved people could shift the balance of the war by weakening the South and inspiring new recruits in the North. But he also feared losing the support of border states that still allowed slavery. Each choice seemed like a step along a tightrope, with failure waiting on either side. Lincoln spent long nights walking the White House halls, carrying the weight of decisions that would decide the nation's future. Newspapers called him indecisive, but those close to him saw the endless calculation and pressure. He was not just choosing military strategies. He was shaping the meaning of America itself. One decision would define whether Lincoln became a failed leader or a legend. The decision was about freedom itself. Would America remain half slave, half free? When Lincoln picked up his pen, millions of people's lives were about to change forever. The war had already dragged on, filled with bloodshed and doubt. But Lincoln believed it needed a new purpose. For months, he wrestled with the idea of turning the fight from a battle to preserve the Union into a crusade for freedom. Advisors warned him it could divide the nation even more. Enemies called him reckless. But Lincoln's heart told him it was the right step. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With one signature, the President of the United States declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of generations of suffering. It did not end slavery everywhere immediately, but it sent a clear message. The Civil War was no longer only about politics or secession. It was about humanity itself. The reaction was explosive. In the South, anger grew fiercer. Confederate leaders accused Lincoln of trying to destroy their way of life. Some border states that still allowed slavery hesitated, fearing rebellion at home. Yet in the North, abolitionists cheered. For the first time, they felt the president had truly joined their cause. Soldiers in Union camps sang new songs of freedom, and African Americans across the country saw a future they had once believed impossible. The proclamation also had global effects. In Europe, nations like Britain and France had considered supporting the South, hoping to protect their cotton trade. But now, siding with the Confederacy meant defending slavery. Public opinion in Europe shifted strongly toward the Union. Lincoln's decision had not only reshaped America's struggle, but influenced the moral stance of the world. Still, the burden grew heavier on Lincoln himself. Critics in the North accused him of going too far, while others claimed he had not gone far enough. Newspapers attacked him daily, painting him as either a dictator or a coward. Death threats multiplied, arriving at the White House in piles. Lincoln often read them with a weary smile, but he knew the danger was real. His choice to free the slaves had lifted him into history, but it also painted a larger target on his back. Through it all, Lincoln remained steady. He believed the war must end with freedom, or it would never end at all. The Emancipation Proclamation was not only a law, it was a promise that the sacrifices of the war would mean something greater than land, politics, or pride. It was a promise that America could change. But freeing slaves made him even more enemies, and death was closing in. After years of war and victory, Lincoln finally had peace, but he did not know it was his last. The Civil War had finally ended in April 1865. For 4 years, the Union had fought against the Confederacy in one of the bloodiest struggles in American history. Now, with General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, the fighting was over. Lincoln, exhausted but relieved, spoke to the crowds with hope in his heart. For the first time in years, he could imagine a future where America would heal. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he spoke of malice toward none, charity for all. Lincoln wanted the South to be welcomed back into the Union, not punished. He believed true victory was not only winning battles, but uniting a divided nation. His vision was simple yet profound. Rebuild the country so that slavery would never return, and the wounds of war would slowly fade into peace. But while Lincoln dreamed of healing, another man dreamed of revenge. John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and a passionate supporter of the Confederacy, saw Lincoln as a tyrant. Booth believed killing the president could save the South's honor and spark chaos. Along with his conspirators, Booth began planning one of the most shocking assassinations in history. In the days after the war ended, Lincoln seemed almost lighter, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted. He even allowed himself moments of joy, visiting troops, meeting citizens, and spending quiet time with his family. But he also confessed to close friends that he had strange dreams of death. In one, he saw himself in the White House, walking past a coffin surrounded by mourners. He did not realize how close this vision was to becoming real. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln and his wife Mary went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., to watch a play called Our American Cousin. The president entered the theater smiling, greeted warmly by the audience who stood to applaud him. For Lincoln, it was a rare night of rest, a chance to step away from years of endless strain. He laughed with Mary, enjoying the play, unaware that Booth was already in the building. Booth knew the theater well. He slipped into the president's box during the play, carrying a small pistol. Timing his move with the audience's laughter, Booth raised his gun and fired. The single shot struck Lincoln in the back of the head. Mary screamed as the theater erupted in panic. Booth leapt onto the stage, shouting words of defiance, and fled into the night. Doctors rushed to Lincoln, carrying him across the street to a nearby house. All night, they fought to save him, but the wound was too grave. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, took his final breath. One bullet ended his life, but his story had just begun.